Hello everyone, I'll be talking about pharmacotherapy of shock today. The specific learning objectives of today's topic are: at the end of the session, one must be able to define shock, enumerate its type, explain the pathophysiology of shock, and describe the pharmacological management of shock with its rationale. Before moving to the topic of shock, let us understand the physiology behind oxygenation of the tissues. The red cell oxygenation occurs when oxygen is first delivered to alveoli and then this oxygen is delivered towards the red cells. Oxygen delivered to alveoli requires adequate O2 supply with patent airways and proper ventilation. This oxygen is now available for transfer towards the RBCs, which again depends on adequate oxygen diffusion into the blood, adequate RBC mass oblique HB levels, that is the amount of HB present in each RBCs, adequate RBC capacity to bind O2, which in turn depends on the pH, temperature, as well as distance between capillaries and the red blood cells. These parameters of delivery of oxygen from airway to the RBCs can be determined by these parameters like blood volume, cardiac output, and conductance. More the blood volume, more will be the access of the blood towards the alveoli. The cardiac output depends upon the heart rate and stroke volume. The cardiac output is the product of heart rate into stroke volume. Stroke volume in turn depends on the preload, the afterload, and the contractility of the heart. The third factor is conductance, that is arterial resistance and venous capacitance. So these variables, that is blood volume, cardiac output, and conductance, will tell us about the perfusion of tissues. What happens in shock is there is acute systemic circulatory failure, due to which there is inadequate perfusion of the tissues. When there is failure of oxygenation of tissues, the tissues opt for anaerobic metabolism to obtain energy. So in simple words, shock is a state of body in which there is deficient blood supply to the tissues. So what happens when the tissues shift from aerobic metabolism to anaerobic metabolism? So inadequate cellular oxygen delivery leads to anaerobic metabolism, which leads to inadequate energy production. As we know that the energy produced by anaerobic metabolism is far less as compared to aerobic metabolism, so that there is metabolic failure as well as lactic acid formation, which is a byproduct of anaerobic metabolism. Lactic acid production leads to metabolic acidosis. So all in all, the metabolic failure and metabolic acidosis leads to cell death. This is how the consequence of shock leads to metabolic failure and metabolic acidosis, and if not treated in time leads to cell death. Shock is divided into three phases, that is compensated, decompensated, and irreversible phases. In the compensated phase of shock, there is reduction in blood pressure, and the body responds to this reduced blood pressure via sensing decreased blood pressure from the carotid baroreceptors, leading to sympathetic stimulation, so that there is release of adrenaline from adrenal medulla. This adrenaline acts on beta 1 receptors in the kidney, leading to renin-angiotensin system activation, which causes increase in renin levels and in turn increase in the angiotensin 2 levels. Adrenaline increases the force of contraction of the heart, the rate, as well as conduction in the heart. The angiotensin 2 is a vasoconstrictor, Also, there is release of ACTH once the hypothalamus senses the decrease in the blood pressure. There is also release of cortisol and glucagon into the blood. All this leads to increase in the cardiac output, heart rate, and increase in peripheral vascular resistance. Also, there is salt and water retention due to angiotensin 2 and cortisol action. There is increase in blood glucose levels, and there is shunting of blood to the core organs, so that the organs that can survive are not provided with blood, but organs which have more sensitivity towards oxygen and glucose, like brain and heart, the blood supply is continued to these organs, although there is decrease in the renal blood flow. Patient in compensated shock shows the symptoms of restlessness and anxiety, which are the earliest sign of shock. Patient might also show the symptoms of nausea, vomiting, and thirst. The skin might be cold in cardiogenic or hypovolemic shock, where there is a decrease in the blood supply, or it might be warm in anaphylactic septic or neurogenic shock, where there is no hypovolemia but still the blood pressure has fallen down due to vasodilation. The blood pressure might be normal or reduced because of the compensatory increase in sympathetic stimulation. The pulse is rapid and bounding. In the decompensated state, the patient in shock in compensated state might not go into the decompensated state, depending on whether the patient has been treated or not. If the patient continues with the symptoms and not treated, the sympathetic stimulation and the other hormones that are released in the body cannot sustain with the hemodynamics, so that there is again reduction in oxygenation and cardiac output. There is peripheral pooling of the blood which leaks into the intracellular spaces. The anaerobic metabolism takes place due to decrease in the oxygen supply, and there is also Rolex formation of the RBCs. All this leads to symptoms of listlessness, confused, and apathetic presentation of the patient. The patient also has a slow speech. The skin is cold, gray, and waxy. The respiratory rate is increased. The blood pressure is reduced, and the patient also shows orthostatic hypotension, which might be moderate to severe. The pulse is rapid, weak, and thready. In the irreversible phase of shock, the peripheral vascular resistance, which was high in the compensated phase, goes down, and the blood pressure is then very low. There is embolism of the Rolex of RBCs that is formed, so that the lungs are filled up with microemboli. There is a metabolic acidosis due to anaerobic metabolism, and the cardiac output further goes down as compared to the decompensated state. The patient presents with confusion and slurred speech if conscious, or he might present as unconscious. The skin is colder, clammy, and cyanotic. The respiration is slow, shallow, and irregular, and blood pressure is very low, with the diastolic reading might be as low as 0, and the pupil is dilated, sluggish. So a patient who is treated in compensated stage has more chances of survival as compared to a patient who is decompensated, and the chances of death of a patient with irreversible shock are very high. So it is very important that the earliest sign of shocks are identified and the patient is immediately treated. A patient of decompensated shock, when in time, proper treatment might uh, make the patient keep the patient alive. The irreversible shock results in the complications such as renal failure, hepatic failure, disseminated intravascular coagulation, multiple organ system failure, adult respiratory distress syndrome, and eventually death. These Complications occur due to decrease in the blood supply to these tissues, leading to metabolic acidosis and death of the tissues. The disseminated intravascular coagulation, in this complication there is massive coagulation in all over the body, so that all the clotting factors are exhausted. The fibrinolysis leads to embolism, leading to choking up of all the vasculature. Similarly, in adult respiratory distress syndrome, there are microemboli that are formed in the lungs, which lead to decrease in the blood supply towards the pulmonary tissues, later on leading to edema of the lungs. Depending upon the cause of shock, it is divided into hypovolemic shock, cardiogenic shock, distributive shock, and obstructive shock. In hypovolemic shock, there is the volume of blood is reduced, so that there is decrease in the preload, increase in systemic vascular resistance due to reflex sympathetic stimulation, and decrease in the cardiac output. The causes of hypovolemic shock are due to traumatic hemorrhage, loss of fluid by gastrointestinal tissues like in diarrhea, loss of the blood plasma into the third space, that is intercellular spaces, leading to edema and burns. The distributive shock presents with decrease in the preload, decrease in the systemic vascular resistance. There might be reduced or increase in the cardiac output. In this type of shock, there is no hypovolemia. There is rather increase in the capacity of the arteries, that is vasodilation, that leads to reduction in the preload. This can occur in sepsis, anaphylaxis, neurogenic shock, pancreatitis. In sepsis, the toxins that are released from the septicemic microorganisms causes vasodilation of the blood vessels. In anaphylaxis, the release of histamine leads to leaky capillaries, dilated and leaky capillaries. In neurogenic shock, there is again paralysis of the sympathetic stimulation, and in pancreatitis there is again vasodilation. So in all these conditions, the prominent feature is vasodilation that leads to decrease in the blood supply to the important core organs of the body. In cardiogenic shock, there is increase in the preload and the systemic vascular resistance. However, there is decrease in the cardiac output due to decrease in the capacity of the heart to pump properly. This can occur in myocardial infarction, symptomatic bradycardia, valvular diseases where the heart is unable to pump against the resistance of the valves, heart blocks, and end-stage renal disease. In all these conditions, the heart is not able to pump properly, leading to cardiogenic shock. The obstructive shock presents with decrease in the preload and systemic vascular resistance, as well as decrease in the cardiac output. This occurs due to an obstruction in the flow of the blood, that might be due to either pulmonary embolism, tension pneumothorax, wherein there is pressure on the heart that develops steadily and leads to improper pumping function of the heart. Even in pericardial tamponade, there is increasing pressure on the heart. So in this way, obstructive shock develops due to obstruction in the flow of the blood. A few important points regarding shock. The different parts of our body are differently sensitive towards the ischemia, so that heart, brain, and lungs can die within 4 to 6 minutes if adequate blood supply is withheld. Therefore, resuscitation is very important in shock. We should recognize the compensatory phase and which forms the restlessness and anxiety as symptoms and treat it so that the patient doesn't go into the decompensatory phase or irreversible phase of shock, because these phases are very difficult to treat and mortality is higher in those phases. The key indicator of the phase of shock is level of consciousness. The fall in blood pressure is a late sign of shock, which is seen in all types of shock irrespective of the cause of the shock. Normal blood pressure doesn't mean that the tissue is normally perfused. As say for example in septic shock the blood pressure is normal, but the uh, blood doesn't perfuse properly to all the tissues. We must look for pallor, tachycardia and capillary refill, which are more a proper indicator of shock as compared to blood pressure. The general management of shock constitutes of immediate transport of the patient to a hospital, starting IV fluids when the patient is being transported, giving appropriate drug to the depending upon the type of shock, maintaining airway if required in intubation, if not oxygenation is to be given to all patients. The body temperature should be maintained and cold IV fluids should be avoided. The mental status, temperature, pulse, respiration, blood pressure and ECG of the patient should be monitored continuously. Let us talk about plasma expanders, which are an essential part of. These IV fluids are divided into colloids and crystalloids. Colloids by definition are not easily crystallized from an aqueous solution, while crystalloids can be easily crystallized. For example, dextran, metastarch and polygylene are the colloids which are used as IV fluids, while the crystalloids that we have is normal saline, dextrose, dextrose normal saline, ringer lactate. The particle size of colloids is very high, as that is the size in nanometers is 1 to 200, while the crystalloids particle size is less than 1 nanometer. The permeability of colloids is very low, so that the colloids remain in the vascular compartment and they do not cross the cell membrane, while the crystalloids easily cross the cell membrane and the vascular permeability is very high, so that they can enter into the extracellular spaces. Colloids are generally stored in refrigerators, while crystalloids can be stored at room temperature. The lifespan of colloid is very short, due to which the concentrated form of colloids are stored, which can have a long lifespan, while crystalloids can be kept as a solution for a long period of time. Colloids are not a source of electrolytes, while crystalloids can provide electrolytes as well. Therefore, crystalloids are important component of hypovolemic shock, where there might be a role of electrolytes as well as water to replace the blood volume that has been lost. Coming to whole blood is obtained from a proper donor and it is preserved in CPD, that is citrate phosphate dextrose, which can be used for until 21 days, or in CPDA, that is citrate phosphate dextrose adenine, which can be kept for a longer period, that is 35 days. In both cases these are stored at 2 to 6 degrees Celsius temperature. The whole blood is used for blood transfusion, which can be either heterologous or autologous. Heterologous meaning transfusing blood of some other donor, while autologous meaning the person who has donated receives the same blood later on when it is required. The advantages of autologous blood transfusion are that no uh, blood matching is required. The disease transmission will not occur because it is the same blood that the patient is receiving. but there is a risk factor that reinfusion of contaminants might occur which were there during donation of the blood. The transfusion of whole blood is indicated in acute hemorrhage where there is the hemoglobin falls down to less than 8 gram percent in patients of aplastic or refractory anemia or thalassemia or hemolytic anemia. In all these anemia there is fall in the Hb level which can be rapidly increased with whole blood. Whole blood also provides for clotting factors, platelets and WBCs which might be required in patients. It also supplies antibodies in severe infections. The goal of treatment with whole blood is to increase the blood volume to more than 90%, to increase the Hb to more than 10%, 10 gram percent, and serum total proteins to more than 60% of the normal, platelet count at least 50,000 per cubic millimeter, and plasma clotting factors at least 35% of the normal, so that the hemodynamics are kept constant or towards the normalcy. However, there are many complications that can occur with uh, infusion of whole blood, like pyrexia that might occur due to the pyrogens that crept inside the the whole blood bag, or the antibodies formed or which were already present, which were active against the donor antigens. This type of adverse drug reaction can be treated with aspirin, antihistaminics, and glucocorticoids. Air embolism might occur during the blood transfusion. Myocardial infarction might occur due to the circulatory overload, as it occurs in patients of thalassemia who receive the blood regularly. So there is overload of the iron as well as the fluids. Therefore, in such patients, furosemide or a strong diuretic is given so that the circulatory overload doesn't occur. The transmission of diseases, blood-borne diseases, can occur with blood transfusion like hepatitis virus B and C, the AIDS virus, the syphilis, and malaria. A donor who is receiving drugs or medications can lead to complications to the person who is receiving the blood. Say for example, a donor who has received vaccines, antiplatelet or anticoagulant drugs can lead to antiplatelet action or anticoagulant action in the recipient. Hemolytic reaction might take place which presents in the form of rigors, jaundice, hemoglobinuria, oliguria, bleeding and coma. And this type of reaction should be rapidly treated with IV mannitol, normal saline and sodium bicarbonate. Hyperkalemia is one of the complications which occurs if the blood to be transfused is not thawed. Iron overload can occur. Citrate intoxication can occur, which is one of the components of the uh, blood that is transfused, so that more than 5 units of blood is not generally transfused to a patient. Adult respiratory distress syndrome can occur in patients who do not have a normal pulmonary function, and hypothermia can occur because the blood is stored in a refrigerator, and there might not be enough of time to make it to the room temperature. Hemorrhagic diastasis can occur due to the antigen antibody response that might occur in the recipient. So the second best option that we can have in a patient of anemia is packed red cells, which is prepared by removing the 40% of plasma from the whole blood, so that the RBC count is not less than 5.5 million per cubic millimeter. These freshly prepared packed red cells are to be infused within 12 hours of preparation and indicated in patients of anemia. The fresh plasma is one of the alternatives where we do not give blood to a patient in whom the hemoglobin levels is normal but there is volume depletion. So fresh plasma is prepared by separating the cellular components of the blood and it is immediately transfused to the recipient. The fresh frozen plasma can be prepared within 8 hours of the receiving the blood from donor and storing it at minus 18 degrees Celsius, which can be stored for a longer period as compared to fresh plasma. The frozen plasma is prepared within 5 days of expiry date of the blood that is received from donor. It is freeze dried so that the shelf life of frozen plasma is up to 5 years. The fresh plasma is used for treatment or prevention of bleeding due to deficiency of clotting factors, as the plasma contains the clotting factors. The human serum albumin is prepared from the whole blood. It is prepared in the concentrations of 5% and 25%, which are to be infused by diluting in normal saline or 5% dextrose. Human albumin is indicated in hypoproteinemia, patients in hypovolemic shock presenting with edema. In these patients, the undiluted albumin is to be injected. It is also used as a vehicle to transport the packed cells, and it is also used in patients with low cardiac reserve. Let us come to the crystalloids. The normal saline is one of the most commonly used crystalloids, which has the osmolarity same as that of the serum, and it rapidly distributes to the extracellular spaces. It is used in hypovolemic shock, patients with dehydration, patients with hyponatremia, hypochloremia, and it is also the most commonly used vehicle for infusion of drugs. The common adverse effect of normal saline is febrile reaction, which might be due to some foreign particles that might be present, or some pyrogens that might have remained in the process of making the normal saline. Therefore, it is very important to see that the normal saline bottle is clear and transparent. Hypernatremia might occur with infusion of normal saline. Pulmonary edema is generally seen when the more than required normal saline is infused in the patients of diarrhea or for any cause. Dextrose is another crystalloid which is present in 5% and 25%. The 5% is commonly used for infusion. It has a lower osmolarity and distributes to the total body water, so that around 1 liter of dextrose 5% is required to increase the blood volume of 100 ml. This crystalloid is given for hypovolemia with renal impairment. It is also given as a source of nutrition. Say for example, when the patient is suffering from hypoglycemia, dextrose is injected. It is also used as a vehicle for drugs like noradrenaline, which does not suit with normal saline. Let us come to the colloids. Colloids are the substances with high molecular weight and generally uh, should have these properties, like they should have oncotic pressure similar to that of plasma, should remain for a longer period in the blood to maintain the blood volume, should be eliminated by the body and not accumulate. They should not be antigenic, allergic or pyrogenic, and should not interfere with grouping and cross matching for blood transfusion. They should remain stable, sterilized and available all the time, and should have a long shelf life. So these are the requirements of an ideal colloidal plasma expander. Dextran is the most commonly used colloids, which is available in Dextran 70, that is 6%, and Dextran 40, that is 10% solution, which is used by diluting in normal saline or 5% dextrose. It has an oncotic pressure similar to that of the plasma and remains in the blood for around 24 hours. It inhibits the Rolex formation of the RBCs and has an anti-sludging effect so that the microemboli are not formed. It improves the microcirculation and it is easy to sterilize and store for a long period. The Dextran 70 is retained in the liver and reticuloendothelial cells and slowly degraded to glucose, while Dextran 40 is rapidly excreted by kidney, that is 50% of it is excreted within 24 hours, so that Dextran 40 can clog the renal tubules and lead to renal complications. The precautions that are to be taken with Dextran is the infusion rate. The higher infusion rate can lead to the renal complications, so that the infusion rate should not be more than 20 ml per kg, and if the urine output is less than 1.5 liters or blood urea is more than 60 mg/cent or the specific gravity increases more than 1045, the transfusion of Dextran should be stopped. During the administration of Dextran, urine output should be high and that can be kept with diuretics or giving IV fluids along with it. This colloid is not to be used for more than 5 days. The common adverse effects seen with Dextran are it interferes with grouping and cross matching, and it also inhibits with the function of platelets and clotting factors, so that giving large dosages of Dextran can lead to hemorrhages. It can also precipitate acute oliguric renal failure due to clogging of the renal tubules. The degraded gelatin polymer or polygelatin is another colloid which is available in the form of 3.5% gelatin. It is non-antigenic and does not interfere with blood grouping and cross matching as we have seen with Dextran. It is not metabolized in the body and has a rather good shelf life. The disadvantage is that it is having a short half-life as compared to Dextran and is very expensive. Adverse effects that are seen with polygelatin are flushing, urticaria and rigors, and bronchospasm and hypotension in some patients. The HETA starch or hydroxyethyl starch is prepared by hydroxyethyl group addition to starch, which makes it resistant to amylase, so that its half-life is increased in the intravascular compartment. It has a larger oncotic pressure, that is approximately towards the human albumin, so that the volume expansion is more than the volume infused, and it acts for 24 hours, is non-allergenic. It does not cause acute renal failure as seen with Dextran or coagulation disturbances when large volumes of dextran are given. The adverse effects seen with hetastarch are anaphylactoid reactions, vomiting and fever with chills. So essentially all forms of colloids are to be looked for the reactions of fever, chills, and these might be present due to some allergic component or pyrogenic components. Now with all this background, let us look at the pharmacotherapy of shock. In hypovolemic shock, the most important thing is to treat the cause leading to the hypovolemia. The cause might be traumatic bleeding or diarrhea. Elevation of lower extremities is important, which increases the venous return towards the heart so that the cardiac output is raised by increasing the preload. The pneumatic anti-shock garment also does the same by increasing the flow towards the heart from the venous vasculature. Two large bore IV lines are secured so that the IV fluids and whole blood or fresh frozen plasma can be given. They are given in such a way that the blood pressure is maintained from 90 to 100 mm of Hg. Electrolyte imbalances are to be treated, more so in patients who have GI losses. Acidosis is treated with injecting the sodium bicarbonate solution, and oxygen is given for patients so that the central venous oxygen is maintained to more than 70%. In case the blood pressure doesn't rise by giving the IV fluids, then vasopressors like ephedrine or noradrenaline are to be considered to elevate the blood pressure. A patient diagnosed with cardiogenic shock should be kept in supine position, or the head and shoulders should be slightly elevated and the lower extremities should not be elevated. This is to prevent the uh, excess of preload towards the heart. The IV access should be secured, and depending upon the cardiovascular status, fluids should be infused. The cause of the cardiogenic shock should be treated if possible, like if the heart rate, if the patient is having bradycardia, the pulse rate should be increased. If there is problem of, if the blood pressure is reduced, then accordingly drug should be given. So if the cardiac contractility has been reduced, we have dobutamine or dopamine. Dopamine has an advantage that it causes increase in the renal vasculature capacity so that the blood flow towards the kidney is maintained in the cardiogenic shock. Dobutamine and dopamine both increase the contractility of the heart so that the cardiac output is maintained. In case the peripheral resistance is reduced, dopamine at high doses leads to increase in the alpha receptor stimulation, leading to increase in peripheral vascular resistance, or norepinephrine is another vasopressor agent that can be used to increase the peripheral resistance. In patients with obstructive shock, the cause of the shock should be treated, like in tension pneumothorax or pericardial tamponade. The air or the fluids that are causing the compression of the heart are to be removed by tapping. Isotonic fluids are given to titrate the blood pressure in case there is no pulmonary edema. The airway should be secured by intubation. In the patients of vasogenic shock, which can be neurogenic shock, septicemic shock, or anaphylactic shock, the need for assisted ventilation is to be considered. The lower extremities are to be elevated to keep the cardiac output normal. The body temperature is maintained because in this patient there is vasodilation and warm extremities that can lead to earlier loss of heat from the body. If the patient is having hypovolemia, then treatment should be considered, and vasopressors can be given to increase the peripheral vascular resistance. Most important is to treat the cause of vasogenic shock. I will see this in following slides. In septic shock, the treatment of infection is very important, for which a broad spectrum antibiotic is to be given. So until the reports of the cause of the septicemic shock are awaited, the antitoxins and monoclonal antibodies are other options that can be tried. Treatment of electrolyte imbalances is important in septic shock. The treatment of acidosis and hypoxemia as with the hypovolemic shock. In patients who are having refractory hypotension, the vasopressors are to be considered. While treating hypotension in patients of shock, it is possible that the patient is in decompensated stage, wherein the sympathetic stimulation has already caused massive vasoconstriction and use of noradrenaline is not helping. So it is important that first fluids are to be given and then vasopressors are to be given, so that the blood volume or blood pressure is maintained. In some cases, this massive vasoconstriction has already occurred, and it is more important to give IV fluids followed by alpha blockers, so that the blood flow towards the tissues is maintained. Now coming to anaphylactic shock, it is one of the type 1 hypersensitivity reaction that occurs due to IgE antibody. This shock occurs due to massive release of histamine in the body, which causes leakage of the plasma into the extracellular spaces, and it also causes massive capillary vasodilation. So the physiological antagonist of histamine, that is adrenaline, is the drug of choice for anaphylactic shock, which is given by intramuscular route. Subcutaneous route may not help because of the decrease in the vascular perfusion. Adrenaline causes vasoconstriction and decreases the leakage of the plasma into the third space, and thus decreases the edema of the body. The respiration is also, the bronchial secretions and bronchial edema is also reduced. Along with hydrocortisone and chlorpheniramine, which is an antihistaminic, the anaphylactic shock can be controlled. The neurogenic shock that generally occurs due to spinal injuries leading to the loss of synthetic tone below the level of spinal injury. It is managed in the same line as of the hypovolemic shock, and ephedrine might be given by intramuscular route as a prophylactic measure to maintain the systemic vascular resistance. The extremes of ages and pregnancy are some special populations in whom there are some variations in the physiology that can cause to defer the treatment in such patients. The children have small blood volume, so there is increased chances of hypovolemia in such cases. The children have very efficient compensatory mechanisms, and so that the failure may lead to sudden shock. Massive fluid infusion is to be avoided because the blood volume is comparatively less in children. High surface to volume ratio leads to increased risk of hypothermia in children. The elderly have a poor cardiovascular performance as compared to the adults, and a rapid decompensation might occur. The sepsis is one of the most likely cause of shock in elderly population, and the hypoperfusion can cause cardiovascular accidents, acute myocardial infarction, seizures, bowel infarcts, renal failure more easily as compared to the adult population. The existing peripheral vascular diseases, weak pulses and altered sensorium make it difficult to assess the condition of elderly population in shock. The existing hypertension may mask the hypoperfusion. The beta blocker also masks the hypoperfusion, and infusion of fluids can easily cause volume overload and lead to congestive heart failure in this population. The onset of signs and symptoms of shock are slower in obstetric patients, and the fluids required for resuscitation of such patients is high as compared to the other populations. Also, the oxygen requirement is increased to 10 to 20%. The pregnant uterus may cause compression of the uh, venous vasculature, so that there is decrease in the preload of the heart. Therefore, patients with late term pregnancy should be advised to take a left side position, so that the compression of the inferior vena cava is lowered. The patients might be well perfused and still the fetus can be in trouble, so that the fetal monitoring in patients of obstetric with shock is important. So I have talked about the what is shock, the types of shock, pathophysiology of shock, and the various plasma expanders, treatment of various types of shock. Thank you.